Okay, chapter 11, number 7 goes something like this. As in problem 11.6, same framework then, same problem, economic problem. Suppose there is a temporary but significant increase in oil prices in an economy with an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. In this case, however, suppose that policymakers, is this monetary policy or fiscal policy? Wait. Suppose that policymakers wish to prevent equilibrium real GDP from changing in response to the oil price. Should they increase or decrease the quantity of money in circulation? So two parts there. Policymakers, which kind? Monetary policy. That I know that because he's talking about the quantity of money. Money is the root word to monetary, which is different from fiscal policy. So we know we're talking about monetary policy. And again, the difference here is that here in our model, using our model, instead of prioritizing and addressing the inflation of this image of stagflation, these policymakers want to address the recessionary gap down here, the decline in output, or put differently, simultaneously, the increase in unemployment. This was the priority. This is the second priority. In number 6, this was the priority, and this is what they had to sacrifice. So let's see what would happen. If they want to address this recessionary gap and they're not as worried about the rise in prices, which, by the way, as we're all quarantined, sequestered, whatever you want to call it for coronavirus, this is what we're doing now as our monetary policy makers are doing this, and our fiscal policy makers are doing the part that we'll get to in a minute at the same time. We can adjust by policy aggregate demand. And so focusing on the monetary policy, the supply of money, what we would do and what we're doing now to address the recessionary gap that we face now, although it's not, I guess it's maybe not the best example because it's not cost push. But what we can do with this situation is to increase the money supply, which is, he just wants you to just memorize increase does this, decrease does that. So we could increase the money supply. That makes money less scarce. It takes less dollars to buy an item because it takes more dollars because each dollar buys less of an item because it's now less valuable. So what we're talking about there is lowering interest rates. As money is less scarce, it's less valuable. The value of money is reflected in the interest rate that a person would pay to borrow money. As it's cheaper to borrow money, it becomes more tempting to do so for houses, cars, for firms to borrow money for more capital so it can raise investment. It also becomes less beneficial to save money, because putting your money away in some kind of an instrument that pays an interest rate will now pay you less, and spending is fun. Since spending is fun and saving is less rewarding, we're encouraged to spend. So that pushes up on consumption. I already mentioned it pushes up on investment to lower interest rates by increasing the money supply. C and I are two of our 4 determinants of aggregate demand. So we're talking about, in this instance, increasing the money supply to decrease interest rates, which would increase aggregate demand. And what we would want to do is increase aggregate demand to there with our monetary policy makers' tool of increasing the money supply. Now look what we get. We face trade-offs. Society faces trade-offs. One of our principles of economics, we can address the recessionary gap and get back to here, right, by increasing aggregate demand through increased money supply. But look what we get over here. We get more inflation. So we face trade-offs. We'll take in number 7, we'll take the inflation to address the recessionary gap. In number 6, we would take the pain of unemployment to address the inflation. That's what the changes to the money supply are more or less expected to do for us. Of course, it depends on where we are initially and what the problem is. In the current problem with coronavirus, we don't have an inflationary problem like we do with cost push inflation. Interestingly, though, there is some shortage of supply because supply chains are hurt. but the real drop is in aggregate demand. So that's why our Federal Reserve is increasing the money supply like heck, actually, to raise aggregate demand. And we don't have any pain with inflation with this because it's just not present now as it is. So that's what we can do to address this with monetary policy, is to increase the money supply, which raises aggregate demand. Fiscal policy, again, what are the tools of the fiscal policy maker? Who's the fiscal policy maker? Governments are fiscal policy makers, i.e. politicians, and their tools are taxes and spending. If they want to stimulate aggregate demand, they could increase G, a determinant of this, with government spending, or they could stimulate consumption or investment by lowering taxes. Looking at Chapter 11 as a whole, let me point out something I haven't. I mentioned somewhere in my videos how these things tend to fall largely along political lines, but they don't really fall along political lines that well, because thinking about our political parties, it tends to be that one party favors Keynesian economics, stimulating economies with government expenditure, and the other party tends to favor Keynesian economics, stimulating aggregate demand or economies with lower taxes. They're both Keynesian approaches to a problem of reduced aggregate demand. So they don't fall strictly along political lines, nor does the let it be approach versus the more interventionist approach fall strictly along political lines, but there tends to be a political element to these things, given the situation each time that we're in one. So I think I've answered the heck out of number 7. What the author was simply looking for was that the monetary policy makers would increase the money supply to increase aggregate demand, and that the problem that we would then face, the trade-off that we would be choosing, would be increased price level or inflation. I hope that was as fun for you as it was for me.